I welcome you once again to our church history course. This is lecture 12. We're looking in the 1800s, and we're going to focus on what Christians did to impact cities for Christ in the 1800s. America and England went through a radical change in that one century. In the year 1800, 94% of Americans lived in rural areas, basically on farms. That meant that 94% of people that were in churches were in small little churches. Probably their kinfolk were buried backyard. And so that was the way it was in the year 1800. By the time you get to the year 1900, only 25% lived in rural areas. 75% of America now lived in the cities. That was because of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of factories and all of that, and that just enticed people to come and flood into the cities. When you're in the country and you've been in that same place for years, you've got ties, a steadiness, all kind of a support system. But when you leave there to go to a city, not knowing anyone, a whole new way of life, it brought up new challenges to reach the people for Christ that were going into the cities. So I want to focus tonight on three people who had a great impact on reaching cities for Christ. The first is a man named William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army. William Booth was a British Methodist pastor whose real passion was evangelism. He was invited by Methodist churches to come and hold evangelistic meetings. He loved to just witness on the streets. But in that particular time, by the time you get to the mid-1800s, the only thing the Methodists would do with their pastors is assign them to a local church. Well, he'd been assigned several times to the local church, and basically he neglected them because he'd rather be off preaching revivals and winning people to Christ. So finally he came to them and said, look, what I need you to do is just make me an evangelist. The Methodists started off with a lot of traveling evangelists. They refused to do that, so he and his wife resigned. No pay, they just resigned so that he could begin doing evangelism. But the Methodists in England turned around and barred any Methodist church from allowing him to preach in their churches. So it was quite a costly stand to say, I'm not going to be a Methodist pastor. He lost the place that he had been a part of. So they began to have that burden. Where do we go to do evangelism? Where's the greatest need? And they began to focus on London. In 1865, he and his wife Catherine set up a tent in East London. That was the worst part of London. 1 out of 5 buildings in East London was a tavern that sold alcohol. Alcoholism was rampant. Poverty was everywhere. Hunger was everywhere. And his heart broke for that. So they went there and they started doing street evangelism and trying to win people to Christ. They were oftentimes pelted with rocks or attacked by mobs. He was so successful in leading alcoholics to Christ that the tavern owners banded together and paid for a mob to start attacking him. The mob named itself the Skeleton Army. And in 1 year alone, 1882, 662 of his Salvation Army workers, he was calling them soldiers by that time, were attacked working on the streets of London. 224 victims of attack were women. Now, the name Salvation Army came by accident. He had a magazine. He was dictating to someone the letter that he was going to put in each monthly issue. And he made this statement. He said, Christ's mission involves using a voluntary army. Well, the guy that was taking dictation changed one of the words. He said, Christ's mission involves a salvation army. And Booth says, that sounds good. That's really what we are, a salvation army. So he had all of his workers start wearing military uniforms. He made himself the general, and then he would have different officers under him, and then there would be the foot soldiers. Many of the traditional Christians attacked his evangelistic methods. They felt like it was just too out of the ordinary. What he would do is they would form bands. They would go to the street corners, play music, draw a crowd, and then he'd have converted alcoholics stand up and give their testimony. Then they'd preach the gospel. But the scene of people in army uniforms playing tambourines and all. One time he was getting ready. He was on a boat, on a dock, was about to go somewhere when he saw one of his bands come to the dock to start playing so they could witness. He knew he still had some time before the boat took off. So he ran down the ramp, joined in with the band, grabbed a tambourine, and started playing it while they sang. When he went back on board, one of the passengers said, "I've never seen anything so undignified in all my life." I love his answer. He said, "If playing a tambourine while standing on my head would lead a soul to Christ, I'd learn how to do it." Now, not only did they do evangelism and they were successful in bringing people to Christ out of those horrible circumstances, he had to meet physical needs. There was so much hunger. He even began factories that would have jobs that paid living wages and would treat the workers by Christian principles, because that was one of the ways he could meet the needs there in the major cities. By the time he died, there were Salvation Army outposts all over the world. Here's a quote from Booth that I believe expresses his heart. He said, "While women weep as they do now, I'll fight. While little children go hungry, I'll fight. While men go to prison, in and out as they do now, I'll fight. While there's a drunkard left, while there's a poor lost girl upon the streets, where there remains one dark soul without the light of God, I'll fight." So that was one person who said, we're going to target these cities. And so he did that in the the last half of 1800s. Another person who's a good picture of someone God raised up to reach a city for Christ, he was actually the first, what we would call megachurch pastor, was a man named Charles Spurgeon. To show you the popularity, the impact Spurgeon had, he died in 1892 at the age of 57. The entire city of London went into mourning. In his church, they put his body out for people to walk by and pay respects for 3 days. 60,000 people walked by that casket to pay respects. When they were moving from the service in the church, the Metropolitan Tabernacle, to go to the graveyard, 100,000 people lined the streets to pay respects, and every business, even the taverns, were closed in his honor. Now, Spurgeon was raised in a small country town. For the first 9 years of his life, he was raised by his grandfather, who was a country preacher, in a town called Stambourne. Stambourne had 500 in the early part of the 1800s when he was being raised. By 1900, the population of Stambourne was 500. There was no changes of modernity. It just stayed that way. And there was something about that raising in the country. Spurgeon never felt comfortable in the city. He would often, whenever he could get a break, would make his way back to Stambourne just to breathe in that rural, slower atmosphere. He returned to live with his parents at age 9. He had read through his preacher grandfather's library, reading great, deep books when he was 7, 8, and 9. He was under deep conviction by the time he was 15. So he decided to go to a worship service, felt compelled to go to a worship service because the strong desire was on him that he needed to be saved. But there was a huge snowstorm that morning. So as he was trying to get to the church he'd picked out, he realized, I'm not going to make it. So he pulled into what was called at that time a primitive Methodist church. They were nicknamed the Shouting Methodists. Their worship style would have been much like the Pentecostals across the tracks in the early part of the 1900s. They were very emotional people. And so he pulled in. There were only 15 people in the service that day because of the snow, and the preacher couldn't make it because of the snow. So a layperson got up. He picked out a verse in Isaiah, "Look unto me, the ye ends of the earth, and be ye saved." And he started preaching, hey, this is not hard, it's looking. Looking ain't hard, you just got to look. And all that. And so he was preaching up a storm on that one verse. And then, this is quotes from Spurgeon's autobiography. That man all of a sudden pointed to him. There's 15 people there, he's the only stranger. Said, "Young man, you look very miserable." Well, I did, but I'd not been accustomed to have remarks made from the pulpit on my personal appearance before. However, it was a good blow, struck right home. He continued, "And you'll always be miserable, miserable in life, miserable in death if you don't obey my text. But if you obey now, this moment, you'll be saved." Then lifting up his hands, he shouted as only a primitive method could do, "Young man, look to Jesus Christ. Look, look, look. You've nothing to do but look and live." And then Spurgeon said, "I looked until I could have almost looked my eyes away. There and then the cloud was gone. The darkness had rolled away. In that moment I saw the sun, and I could have risen that instant and sung with the most enthusiastic of them of the precious blood of Christ and the simple faith which looks alone to him. Oh, that somebody had told me this before. Trust Christ, and you shall be saved. So he had that dramatic conversion. Now, his parents were a part of a church that practiced infant baptism. He had been baptized. His grandfather did that when he was a baby. But as he studied the scripture, he decided that he needed to join a Baptist church, and he went to a small all the Baptist churches were small then. Went to a Baptist church, got baptized. His mother remarked, I prayed for you to become a Christian, but I didn't pray for you to become a Baptist. Well, he became very active in that church as a teenager. 16 or so. The preacher said, look, there's a Baptist church down the road. They have no one to lead the services next Sunday. I need you two. I need one to lead the music and one to go preach. So you two take off. It's 5 miles. Start walking. So as they were walking there, both of them assumed that the other one was going to preach and they were going to lead the music. And the other guy said, I am not preaching. So he had no time to prepare. He only had that 5-mile walk to put some thoughts in his mind. But when he entered the pulpit, the giftedness of Spurgeon became evident at all. He was one of the greatest preachers that's ever lived. And God came down on that meeting. So he began to preach in different churches. He got the nickname, the boy wonder of the Fens. The Fens is a British term for the marshes. And so he began to do that. Well, at age 17, he was called to a small rural church in Waterbeach, England. But people walked miles to hear him. They kept hearing about this incredible boy preacher. They couldn't put everybody in. They would open the windows up on the church so people could stand outside and listen to him. Well, he was there for 2 years, from age 17 to age 19. The word had gotten to a church that had once been one of the strongest Baptist churches, New Park Street Baptist in South London. If you're a real Baptist history nut, two of their previous pastors were John Gill and Benjamin Keach. So they had had some of the most well-known Baptist theologians pastor in the past, but they had shrunk through the years. They were down to 200 people. If it continued like that, they would close the church. So they invited him to preach, knowing this was an act of desperation. He'd never been to school. He was 19 years old. His future wife, Susanna, was in the room, and she said when he went to the pulpit, she was so put off because if there was ever someone who looked like a country bumpkin, it was him. His clothes did not match. He had this gaudiest handkerchief that was wild colored in his pocket. But when he started preaching, nobody was looking at what he was wearing. God came down on that room. So they called him to be a pastor at age 19. As I said, the building held 1,200, but within a year, they were turning people away. So they said, we've got to do a building expansion. So they decided to expand their sanctuary from 1,200 to 1,800, but they needed a place to meet. So they rented Exeter Hall, which could seat 4,000 people. And before the year was over, at age 21, they were turning away as many as they were seating in that building on Sundays. So now that's a problem. You're building a building that will hold 1,800 and you're having 4,000 on Sunday. By the time they finished that building program, the only thing that the original building could be used was for their Tuesday night services. They held their services on Tuesday night. And it just became the headquarters, but they continued to meet in secular places. Had the problem. How can you face turning away 4,000 people? So they decided to do something that was extremely bold. They rented the largest place that someone could hear a lecture in the 1800s in London, the Surrey Gardens Lecture Center. 1,200 people could listen to a lecture there. So they announced that the church was moving to this, 12,000 could fit in it, this moving to a 12,000 seat place to hold their worship services. The first Sunday they were there, they turned away probably 8,000 people. They filled it to capacity and beyond and turned away people. But folks, you've got to understand this. There were a lot, especially of pastors in London, that were really jealous of him and hated him. And they did something diabolical. They placed men in that lecture center, and they had a signal they would give to each other after he started preaching. And at the same time, all of them stood up and yelled, "Fire! Fire! Run for your lives! The balcony's about to collapse." And there was a panic. And in the ensuing panic, 8 people were trampled to death. Now, Spurgeon didn't know that. He used his booming voice to try to settle them down. And finally, he got them calm and he helped them leave in an orderly fashion. But he would not know until after this that 8 people were killed. Well, the newspapers crucified him that week. This is an egotist who doesn't care about people's lives. He only wants to draw big crowds in secular places. And so they tore into him. But what happened to Spurgeon was, as soon as he had dismissed people, he collapsed on the stage. Fortunately, his wife had the wisdom to take him to the home of an elder so that the press would not find him. But she wasn't sure if he was going to live. He wrote this in his autobiography. Later he remarked, "Perhaps never soul went so near the burning furnace of insanity and yet came away unharmed." He found comfort from Philippians 2, where it says God has given Jesus the name above every other name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord, to the glory of the Father. I've actually read the sermon that he preached, not the next Sunday, but it was 2 weeks later before he could return to preach again. And he stood up and he said to the people, "I have to apologize. I've been so emotionally and physically exhausted. I could not bring myself to prepare a sermon, but I have a text, and I'm here today to exalt Jesus." And then he said in that sermon, whatever they say about Spurgeon, may the name of Jesus be exalted. It doesn't matter what they say about Spurgeon. And he preached, and God continued to move in his life. But what that did, that first encounter with deep depression, what I've seen in my own experience, and then I've talked to others, is if you ever have a dramatic experience with depression like that, it's kind of like spraining an ankle severely. After that, it doesn't take much to re-sprain it. And he would have a continual bout with depression the rest of his life. One year, he missed 3 Sundays in a row because he just was unable to preach. One year, he was doubting his salvation, sent word to his elders, "I can't preach. I'm not even sure if I'm saved," because he was in such a grip of depression. So he decided to go back to that little Baptist church where he was baptized, where they sent him out on that 5-mile walk. And he showed up. By this time, Spurgeon's sermons were being printed in newspapers all over the world. Well, that country preacher had taken one of his old sermons and was preaching it word for word that Sunday morning. Didn't know Spurgeon was in the building. He sat on the back. When the service was over, he walked to the front. The man's face sunk. He said, "Oh, Mr. Spurgeon, I've got to apologize." Don't apologize. While you preach, God let me know I am saved." So he had that burden that he bore of dealing with the depression. But he would evaluate, and I believe this is something that every pastor ought to look into. He has a book called Lectures to My Students. He formed a college to produce preachers. I'll talk about that in a minute. But he talked about how preachers are more prone than anyone to depression, but he had more reasons than most preachers. Let me give you a quote from him about his life and what he was going through at that time. And I'll talk about these things mentioned later on. "No one living knows the toil and care I have to bear. I ask for no sympathy, but I ask indulgence if sometimes I forget something. I have to look after the orphanage. I have a charge of a church with 4,000 members. Sometimes there are marriages and burials to be undertaken. The weekly sermon has to be revised before it's printed. He had a magazine, The Sword and Trowel. It has to be edited. Besides that, every week he received 500 letters and he answered them all." And then he added this. "This, however, is only half my duty, for there are innumerable churches established by friends with the affairs of which I'm closely connected, to say nothing of the cases of difficulty which are constantly being referred to me." In 1872, when he was thinking about the pastoral life, he said this: "The ministry is a matter which wears the brain and strains the heart and drains out the life of a man if he attends to it as he should." But let me give you some of the accomplishments that he did. He built this mega church, and it was the first church that I know of in modern history that built a fellowship hall with a kitchen. It became one of those patterns of a 7-day-a-week church with constant ministries. He did start an orphanage to care for the many orphans that were there on the south side of London. Realizing that the typical Baptist colleges were producing dead preachers, he formed his own Baptist college, and by the time he died, 25% of the Baptist pastors in Britain had graduated from his college. In those days before radio, I'd mentioned that his sermons were being printed in newspapers, but they were also being sold. None of the money went to his hands. It went to all of these enterprises that he was doing. But his sermons sold 20,000 copies a week, and they were translated into 20 languages. What he and his wife did was they would take the money that would come from things like the sale of the sermons, and he would purchase books to be sent free of charge to those country pastors all across Britain who didn't have access to good, life-changing books to help them in the ministry. At the age of 50, they celebrated his birthday. Lord Shaftesbury, one of the great Christian statesmen, was there, and they called off a list of 66 organizations that he had started and that were run out of this church in London. But the last battle that he had was the battle that his wife was convinced took his life. He was looking across his Baptist denomination, and by the time you get into the 1890s, 1880s, liberalism had begun in Germany. That doubting that the Bible is true, it had come across the English Channel, and many of the British pastors were infected with those doubts. Evolution had been started by an Englishman. The theory of evolution had been started by an Englishman, and that was infecting people's trust in the Bible. So he went to his denomination and said, we've got to watch out. We've got people that don't even believe the basic doctrines of Christianity. So he urged his denomination to develop a doctrinal statement that in order to be a Baptist, you had to say, I believe these things. Not only did they turn him down, with an over 90% vote, the denomination voted to censor him, to kick him out. When the vote was announced, hats were thrown in the air, rejoicing. And shortly after that, he died. The third person I want to talk about is my favorite Christian, D.L. Moody. I can't wait to see him in heaven. And D.L. Moody's entire evangelistic ministry was focused on winning people to Christ in the major cities of Britain and America. But once again, like so many people in that day and time, he was born in a rural area of Massachusetts. His father, who was a bricklayer, died when Moody was 4 and left his wife with no money and no income and 7 children. What she did was she basically said, you can have a few years to go to school and then you've got to go to work because we've got to pay these bills. So he got perhaps 4 years of education in his life. She would often, as the kids got older, try to find kinfolk that she could send them off to because she just could not afford to clothe them and feed them. So at age 17, he was sent to an uncle who lived in Boston. He had no spiritual background, never taught any Bible, knew nothing of Christian doctrine, was completely in darkness. The uncle was a Christian. He said, I'll give you a job in my shoe store, but I've got one requirement. You have to go to Sunday school and church in my church. And so he agreed to that. And God had a person picked out that would be the person that would lead D.L. Moody to Christ. By the way, he excelled in selling shoes. He was an incredible salesman. That's basically what he was as an evangelist, was God's salesman. He would have been a very successful man. But his Sunday school teacher, Edward Kimball, had a burden for this boy who knew nothing about the Bible, went to his store, found him, opened up the Bible, and led D.L. Moody to Christ. Well, one of the first things that happened was Moody wanted to bring some of the fellow teenagers that he was meeting to church with him, but in that day and time, the way that churches were financed was not through offerings taken on Sunday. They rented pews. So you rented a pew for a year, and if you weren't there, the pew had to stay empty because you'd rented that pew. And so how in the world can you invite people when you've got... So what he did was he took the money he was making selling shoes and he rented 3 pews and he filled them up with teenagers. Well, not long after that, his heart began to long for more than staid Boston, and there was one exciting city that had just come on the scene that was blowing up in population and opportunities. It was Chicago. So he moved to Chicago, and he did well as a salesman. But he wanted to do something for the Lord, so he got involved in the Sunday school movement. Now, I've got to explain something about the 1800s. When I say Sunday school now, most churches think, well, that's the hour before you go to worship, where everybody in different ages are taught. No, that's not what Sunday school was in the 1800s. You've got to understand, in the mid-1800s, there were no laws that kept children from the factories, so poor children were working 6 days a week in the factory, and they had no schooling. So what Christians would do on Sunday afternoon, they would worship in their church, and then they'd go to the slums, and they'd literally form a Sunday school, and the kids would be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic and Jesus. So he got a group of volunteers, and the only place he could rent was a saloon. That saloon was used on Saturday nights, so he had to get his volunteers to come in on Sunday morning, clean it up, get ready. But once again, that salesman in him, he filled his pockets full of candy, walked through the slums and said, I'll give you a piece of candy if you follow me. And then he bought a pony. He said, if you want to come to, if you'll come with me to Sunday school, you can ride the pony. End result, by 1860, there were over 1,000 kids in this Sunday school. It was the largest Sunday school in the world in the darkest slum of Chicago. It was so well known as a strong Sunday school that Abraham Lincoln made a campaign stop there to get his photo taken. Well, as he won the kids to Christ, the parents began coming to him in this slum. We've got no church for us. So they basically formed a church, the Illinois Street Church. But there was an incident that happened there that changed his life completely in the direction of his career. He had a Sunday school teacher that came to him and said, I've got a breathing disease. And my doctor said I've got to go to a dry climate, so I've got to leave Chicago. He said, but Mr. Moody, I've got a burden. I have 8 girls in my Sunday school class, and none of them are saved. Before I leave, will you go with me to their house? And can we try to win them to Christ? And so Moody and this teacher went, and they personally went to each one, led them to Jesus, and Moody arranged a surprise. He arranged for all girls to be at the railroad station when this man was getting on the train to go to the southwest part of the United States. And he said, as he was getting ready, the last call was going, he was about to get on the train. He said, this man looked at those girls with tears in his eyes, and he pointed his finger to the sky. I'll see you there, pointing toward heaven. And Moody remarked, I couldn't sell shoes after that. So he had made a name in the Sunday school world, had even gone to England to promote this new thing called Sunday schools. But there was another thing that had been raised up to reach the young men especially who were coming into the cities. It was an organization called the Ymca, the Young Men's Christian Association, because one of the things they needed some place to stay, but they needed to have a place to stay where they might hear about Jesus and be kept from some of the temptations. So he resigned from selling shoes and became a YMCA missionary. So he has church on Sunday with Sunday school. He's a YMCA, builds the YMCA building, working with them. When the war broke out in 1861, he volunteered as a YMCA chaplain to go to the battlefield so that he would take seasons where he would go off, and his job was to go walk the battlefield after the battles. It was a horrible thing in the Civil War. Men would lay out there in the fields for hours dying because there was nothing to be done. And he would go out to those battlefields and kneel next to them and talk to them about Jesus. And he would often tell stories about those days in his future sermons. But another thing that he did during that time when he was a pastor there, God changed his heart about the direction of his preaching. On one of his Sunday school trips earlier, he had met a young pastor named Henry Morehouse. And basically, he had said, when you come to America, come preach in my church. Well, one day Morehouse showed up. And he says, you told me to come. Well, it turns out he had to go and do something with YMCA the next Sunday. So he told his elders, let him preach on Sunday morning. If he's good, you can extend the meeting. So he came back midweek, and the meetings were going. He asked his wife, how's he doing? And she said, he's a better preacher than you. And what that young man had done every service is he had read John 3:16 every sermon and preached a sermon on John 3:16 every night. So Moody came there and continued on through the rest of the week, and every sermon he heard was John 3:16. And Henry Morehouse constantly preached the love of God. This is another change that happened with Moody. Up till Moody, the evangelist of the previous 100 or so years basically preached the wrath of God. Wesley said that his motto was, the Methodism is open to anyone who wants to flee the wrath to come. So basically, you would preach hell, you would preach judgment, you need to come and repent before it's too late. He saw that God loves sinners. In fact, he stated that before that week, I didn't even believe that God could love sinners. But the love of God changed his life. He also did one more thing that was his innovation. Moody was tone deaf. He wouldn't have known a good sound of a singer, but he knew what music could do. He found a great musician named Ymca, who was a postal worker, and he said, quit your job, you're coming with me. And so he combined music with his evangelism. And that leads us to when God opened up a door that changed his ministry and made it worldwide. In 1873, two leading pastors in England got together, sent him enough money to buy a one-way ticket for him, Sankey, and both their wives to go by boat to England to do some evangelistic work that they would sponsor. By the time they arrived, both men were dead. So they just used a one-way ticket and had no invitations of where to preach. But he remembered someone in a small town that had said to him, if you're ever in England, come preach for me. So they went and showed up and said, you said it. And so they began preaching. And so from 1873 to 1875, God's hand was on that. People began to grow. The crowds began. And he went from town to town in Britain, in Scotland. It climaxed with 6 months in London, where over 2 million people came to hear him preach, including Queen Victoria, who disguised herself in order to come so she could see what in the world was happening. By the time he had finished that crusade in England, those series of meetings in England, America was waiting, saying, we want you back. And so he had several innovations that he brought into evangelism, because the only thing he did the rest of his life was target cities. And so his first invitation was to go to New York, and he decided that I'll use secular venues to win lost people to Christ, because they're not going to go to churches. So he rented, for the first New York meeting, P.T. Barnum's Hippodrome, which, by the way, today is the Madison Square Gardens. So he rented that as the place where he held his meetings. They traveled around, and he went from city to city. Sankey was teaching them a new catchy type of music called gospel songs. Now, it's not gospel quartet. What that was, it was a new innovation where you would take, say, alas, and did my Savior bleed, and add a peppy chorus like at the cross, when I first saw the light. And so you had, it was a song that was peppy and had a chorus. And so they began to print songbooks, and folks, those songbooks sold for millions of dollars. And what he did was he used that to invest in the kingdom. Moody Bible Institute was built by songbook money. He prayed one time, Lord, let millions pass through my hands as long as none of it sticks. In 1892, when he was on one of his many trips over to England, he would constantly go back and forth. He had a major heart attack. His son was with him on that trip. The doctor who examined him said, your heart is so damaged you can never preach again. His son said, Dad, you got to quit preaching. So they got on a boat to come back home to be with his family. Halfway across the ocean, the motor exploded, and it pierced the hull. And they began to take in water. And this is way before the Titanic, but the same thing was true. There weren't enough lifeboats for the men to have a lifeboat. So he and his son realized, we're about to die, because there's nothing we can do but stay on board and go down. Just then, a boat came over the horizon, and they were saved. And he said, God, I got the message. It's up to you when I die. If you want me to continue preaching, I will. And some of his greatest ministry happened after 1892. In fact, in 1893, Chicago had the great Chicago World's Fair. People from all over the world set up booths. And in that World's Ferris wheel was first shown in the Chicago World's Fair. Well, the Chicago World's Fair made the decision that they'd be open on Sundays. And so the local pastor said, let's form a boycott of the Chicago World's Fair. He said, no, let's don't do that. Let's rent a room right across from the entrance. And let's have church services all day long. Just 1 hour and another hour and another hour and get people in. On one single day, 130,000 people came into the services at the entrance. More people went to the church services that day than went into the World's Fair that day. And he held continual meetings. And so God used him. In November of 1899, he was preaching in Kansas City when he had his second heart attack. He was sent by train to go back home. He never recovered from this. He could hardly breathe. One day when he was struggling for breath, his son said to him, "Dad, I'm going to pray for God to heal you." And he says, "No, don't do that, son. So much I love is over there now." Because a lot of the folks that he'd been serving the Lord with were now in heaven. He'd lost 2 grandchildren in the last 2 years. And they were around his bedside. And they've given us the words that he said. He looked up and said, "If this is heaven, it's wonderful." And then he said to his wife, Emma, "I see the grandchildren." And he died. 3 extraordinary people who focused on the cities. Now, for our students today, your discussion question is this. Would you give me an essay of at least 500 words? Listening to what we've done about these men and how they target the cities, could you find anything from these men's lives, this lecture, that will help us in reaching the most unreached group in this country, the people in the major cities? Thank you.